Camino to Nowhere. What the heck is that? I'll explain, coming right up. So what do I mean by the Camino to Nowhere? Let me take a step back for a minute and I'll just explain the thought that's been going through my head for the last week or so. So you've probably realised that there's a lot of press coverage at the moment about cities in Spain getting a little bit fed up with tourists, and Barcelona particularly. It's pushing up house prices because everybody's turning their apartments into Airbnb for tourists and all that kind of thing. My brother actually sent me a more recent article about similar sorts of reactions in Santiago de Compostela. Not quite as vocal as Barcelona, but similar. And local people are, to a degree, getting a little bit fed up with how crowded it becomes in the height of the season. Same sorts of problems. A lot of accommodation is being given over to Airbnb, and it's pushing people out of the city. You know, people who work in Santiago are finding it harder to find decent priced accommodation. I think actually, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I think Santiago has banned Airbnb for that reason. But you know, you can imagine there's the noise going through the streets, you know, particularly sort of young big groups coming through and singing, and the click-clack of poles and all the rest of it. Anyway, it got me thinking, are there alternative places to walk to? Now, this might sound a little bit ludicrous because on this channel we talk about the Camino de Santiago, and it's a pilgrimage to Santiago. So without Santiago, how does it work? Well, bear with me for a minute. So I was reflecting on it and thinking, look, I've walked into Santiago a few times. I love it. I find it a bit busy. As I've mentioned a few times on the channel, it can be a little bit disappointing emotionally, I think, when you end your Camino in Santiago. So be prepared for that. You know, there's that sadness and sense of loss when you've finished. So it's not all joy. It's a wonderful place to visit, of course. And Pat and I always visit the cathedral, and we go down into the crypt where the bones of St. James are, and all of that is a great experience. But kind of on the flip side, I'm thinking, well, we're part of the problem. You know, we've had our visit to Santiago. Do we need to keep going there? So I actually raised this topic online for a bit of a discussion, and there was lots of interesting responses, because I started to think, well, are there other places that I could end my Camino? But of course, this raises an interesting question in your mind, because a lot of people talk about the Camino as the destination is really the journey. You know, the journey is the destination, not Santiago itself. And I've always been a firm believer in that to a large extent, because the Camino to me is something that I like to do slowly. I intentionally walk shorter distances. I walk slowly. I want to enjoy the whole journey. Lots of people I know sort of tend to rush through it, and you know, for me, that's a little bit sad. I like to slow the whole thing up because, you know, I've ended in Santiago a few times and I don't want that to happen too quickly. The enjoyment, to a large part, is the journey itself. So I thought, well, okay, Rob, well, you don't have to finish in Santiago then, do you? Because the journey is the destination. And then I thought about it a little bit more and I thought, no, that'd be really odd, because Santiago and arriving in Santiago is the goal. It's the purpose of the whole pilgrimage. It's to visit the cathedral, to venerate the bones of the saint in the crypt. You know, that's the whole point. If you're not walking your pilgrimage to Santiago, does it still have the same point? And there was lots of suggestions from people online saying, well, actually you could walk, I think it was the Norte or the Primitivo, into Oviedo. Apparently that has a wonderful cathedral with lots of relics of the saints, you know, and that could be a good destination, Rob. And I'm thinking, yeah, you know, that's certainly one worth looking at. And then someone else mentioned some of the Camino routes in Germany. And I lived in Germany briefly, so I know Germany. I speak a little bit of the language. I love the people and the landscapes and the food. And I thought, yeah, you know, let's think about doing a Camino in Germany. And in fact, there's one along the Moselle River, which looks really terrific. But I kept circling back to this question of how much of the Camino for me, for Pat, is all about the journey and how much is the destination. And if you take away the destination, does that somehow devalue or lessen the experience of the journey itself? So I kind of put it out there. What do you think? Particularly those who've walked a Camino or two, and I know there's a few subscribers here who've walked lots of Caminos. Julian, I'm thinking of you. You've walked loads of them. So what are your thoughts about that? If you take away the destination, is it really still a Camino? I'm not sure. I'm sort of struggling with that idea. So now let me talk about our next Camino, because that is kind of an example. So I've mentioned a couple of times our next Camino is going to be a hybrid. Why? I'll recap very briefly. Pat would like to get 2 more Compostelas for deceased relatives. You know, you can have them, what's the term, Vicari Pro. You can have a deceased relative's name put on the Compostela alongside yours, so you're walking on behalf of someone else. It's generally for someone who can't walk themselves. They don't have to be deceased. But Pat would like a couple more Compostelas, so I've engineered a bit of a hybrid Camino where, working backwards, where the last bit is going to be from Mochia through Finisterre back to Santiago. So that's got all the elements, hasn't it? You know, we're walking towards Santiago, we're going to finish in the cathedral. That will feel like a Camino in its own right. Prior to that, we're going to walk the last part of the Sanabres, starting in Orense and ending in Santiago. That will feel like a Camino. It's got all the elements. And then coming back even further, we're going to start in Madrid and we're going to walk part of the Camino Madrid. It goes all the way up to Sahagún. I think time pressures will dictate that we won't go quite that far, but that one, for us, is going to be a Camino to nowhere, because we're going to walk from Madrid for 8-9 days, then we're going to jump on a train, we're going to go down to Salamanca, and then we're going to go up to Orense to start our walk into Santiago. So I suppose that's still going to feel like a Camino, because ultimately we're heading to Santiago. That's probably the difference. But I wonder, some of the other routes that I'm thinking of are way down in the southeast. I should have looked these up. The Mozarabe, for example, which ends, I think, in Merida. You know, would I just walk that, get to Merida and fly home? Would it feel like a Camino? That one in Germany I mentioned, would we walk that and fly home? And would that feel the same? Would it feel like a Camino? I don't think so. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. You know, I think it would just feel more like a hike to me. You know, an interesting hike, but without that sense of purpose, without that clear destination that pilgrimage should really have. And that purpose and destination, I think, is a very important part. If it's not, it doesn't have to be the major part. You know, I'm kind of faffing around a bit here. The journey is very much a big part of it. But if you take away the destination, does it devalue the journey? I think for me it does. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And particularly if you've walked a Camino in bits. So lots of people do this because of time pressures. They might walk the Camino Frances, you know, over 4 years or something, walking, you know, section by section by section. I guess that feels like a true Camino, doesn't it? Because your ultimate goal is that you're moving closer and closer towards Santiago, and then you get to Santiago. Have you walked, you know, a section of a particular route and not ended in Santiago? How did that feel? Now I'm starting to waffle, but I'm curious. It's throwing up questions in my mind, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Does your Camino have to end in Santiago? It kind of does, doesn't it? Kind of does. As I say that out loud, it doesn't sound quite right for it not to. But let me know your thoughts. Would you do a Camino to nowhere, or has it got to be to somewhere? Love to hear your thoughts. Sorry, I hadn't had a couple of videos on for a couple of weeks now. Things have been a little bit crazy at work. But I do have another one ready to go, and that's going to be about clothing, and particularly the importance of understanding the weather conditions and how that dictates the sort of clothing you should be carrying, and things to watch out for in terms of weather. So watch out for that one in the next week or two. But for now, Camino to Nowhere or somewhere. Let me know your thoughts. Bye for now.